Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today on the Beijing Plus 25 anniversary, taking stock of where we're at and our opportunities ahead with Katherine Scott from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. My name is Keitha Mercer. I am the Director of Community Initiatives and Grants here at the Canadian Women's Foundation, and I'll be moderating today. So a couple of quick updates about how to use the platform if you've never used it before. We have a couple of options for ways that you can interact. So you can either click the little hand button over on your side panel, and that will raise your hand. And then I can unmute you so that you can ask a question out loud if you'd like. We'd love to hear your voice. Or you can put your question in the question box and I will read it out loud for you. Catherine's going to take questions sort of at the end of every section. So if we don't get to you right away, it's because we're waiting for that. If you are interested in following along on your own version of the PowerPoint, if you look in the handout section, we have the PowerPoint presentation there as a PDF. And we also have the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action in both English and French, and the Unfinished Business Report in both English and French. So those are two of the reports that Katherine will be referencing throughout her presentation, but there are also some other things that she has linked in her presentation that you can click on through the PDF. So we'll give people a second to sign in as they're joining up. So like I said, you're automatically muted when you join, but if you have a microphone and want to ask anything out loud, just click the little hand button and we will unmute you so we can hear your voice. So thank you very much, Katherine, for agreeing to do this presentation today. I know that the folks on the line who are going down to New York are really interested in how the process works and what we'll be discussing, especially since this is a special year. And the folks who aren't going to be in New York this year are equally interested in what's going to happen. So thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. That's just great. So shall we, Keitha, we're ready to go. Should we start?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat to you today about the Beijing Plus 25 anniversary, and in particular the work that I've been doing. I'm Katherine Scott and I work at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. I head up the Making Women Count project here, and it was my privilege this past year to be involved with a large group of national women's groups, including the Women's Foundation, that came together to mark the Beijing anniversary by conducting our own review of women's progress in Canada. So this is a big year, 2020. It's the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. It's the focus of attention at the CSW 64 down in New York in March, as well as several other gatherings this coming year to mark the anniversary. So today, what I thought I'd do is I'd lay out some of the work that we've done, the National Coalition, the National Beijing Plus 25 Network has done, and our own production of our own shadow or parallel report called Unfinished Business. And I'll spend some time as well talking about what the review process involves this year to mark the anniversary. Heads up that it's quite complex and complicated. There's there's a formal process to mark the Beijing anniversary, as well as what women's groups around the world are doing. And there are several opportunities for women's groups here in Canada to engage. So I'm going to highlight some of those opportunities for you. Toward the end of the presentation, I'll look in a bit more detail at our own review called Unfinished Business. And I'm very happy to field questions about this, about the process and about our report, and hope that you find it useful. I've included, as Keith already mentioned, many of the links that you might find useful in taking away, and I'm always happy to field any questions during the presentation, or you can get a hold of me afterwards. I've got my contact information at the end. So thanks again. And so I thought we'll get going. Hopefully this, here we go. So as I said, I want to spend some time today talking about the Beijing Plus 25 review. It's certainly the context in the background and what's involved in the review. I'll touch on our own parallel report called Unfinished Business, and I'll conclude by talking about opportunities for engagement for women's groups here in Canada to engage in the global process. Many of you are going to New York, certainly that'll be a big focus, but also to engage domestically, because, you know, certainly from my perspective, sitting in a national think tank that doing largely domestic work on gender equality, we see certainly the work in the Beijing Network and the production of the Unfinished Business, the parallel report, certainly is a platform for domestic advocacy. What can we be doing in Canada with this new government to move the gender equality agenda forward? So first bit here is Beijing Platform for Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. Back in 1995, this was a key year, certainly for the women's movement here in Canada, and an important global year as well. It was 50,000 delegates gathered in Beijing in 1995 to negotiate what continues to be arguably the most progressive blueprint for achieving women's rights that has ever been developed. It was an exciting time. Actually, it's been interesting hearing from different women who actually were involved in the in Beijing. That was the 4th World Conference on Women, and the excitement that sort of marked that period. After what was a significant recession and the falling of the Berlin Wall, this was certainly a moment of hope that this was a time when putting women's rights onto the global agenda was front and center. The key mobilizing call at the time was women's rights were human rights, which was a critical intervention, and certainly to bring a gender lens to what had been often a gender-free or certainly women's rights hadn't been positioned as human rights. It was an important development in our thinking and the evolution of human rights instruments at the UN. And as I said, the exciting time in Beijing. So at that time, the outcome document, the platform, and the Declaration for Action was adopted unanimously by 189 countries that were participating, including Canada, and it's still considered an important global document on gender equality. So in Canada, of course, there were several groups that were involved at the time, lobbying and not only about the content of the Beijing platform, but obviously lobbying the Canadian government as well. There was the Canadian Beijing Facilitating Committee, and they were very involved and had support from Status of Women in Canada at the time to support, through a grant, to support the participation of Canadian NGOs going to Beijing, but also to support they were supported to create, had crafted their own agenda, what should be included in the document. Those are some of you'll see on your screen, some of the documents that they produced at the time, an agenda for action, and again, a follow-up guide for Beijing. So again, the focus on the Canadian government not only participating, but adopting the declaration, and as well setting up the what would be needed to actually monitor implementation of the Beijing Declaration. Fast forward to again, the group women's organizations met again, and several years later, really got the sense that the Canadian government was not actually taking action to set up, to move to implement the declaration. You see here that this was the origins of the emergence of FAFIA at that time, the Feminist Alliance for International Action. They came together formally, and it launched in 1999 to actually organize to hold Canada to account, that their actual explicit mandate was that now we had this important international human rights declaration, including CEDAW, which of course is monitored every year in New York, that Canada was failing to meet its commitments under these declarations. And so this group formally launched in 1999 with the explicit goal of monitoring compliance here in Canada. FAFIA sort of held the pen and produced at that time in 2000. That was Beijing +5. They produced Canada's parallel report for Beijing +5, and also for Beijing +10 and Beijing +15. As a quick aside, I'd have to say that women feminists were involved, and women's organizations were very involved in assessing progress. But after 1995 and the initial mobilizing around the actual declaration, the passing of the actual declaration, support from the Canadian government was thin on the ground. Certainly under the during the Harper years, when there were significant cuts to support to women's organizations, certainly support for participation in the Beijing review process and for the other feminist groups that were organizing on the ground to review Canada's process was absent. So during this time, groups came together to do, as I said, in 5 years, 10 years, 15 and 20 years later, but with little support. And in fact, we'd had little support this time around too, but which isn't to say the groups, which I think is an important piece of the context around where the Canadian women's movement is and how much, how we've tried to come and sustain interest and focus on Beijing. So fast forward to 2019. So women's groups came together again to assess progress on implementing the Beijing Declaration and Platform. This was a network largely of national women's organizations or other ones who had representation in sectors like immigration and the like. And the goal, of course, was to produce a review of our progress, largely over the last 5 years. I'd like to give a shout out certainly to groups like the Canadian Labour Congress and the Women's Foundation, Canadian Women's Foundation, who are key, as well as the YWCA, who've been key to supporting the coalition in bringing women groups together. They played a really important role, trying to keep the focus on the declaration and to supporting advocacy around the host of issues that we've identified in our parallel report. So as I said, the network came together this last year and we produced a report which in effect assessed the tenure or the tenure of the Liberal government in power. It was its focus largely on the federal government. And it was really an interesting, exciting and opportunity to reflect together on where we've come these past 25 years and where we need to go. It was really important as well as an opportunity to reflect on progress against what has plainly been a tide of rising hostility against women's rights. We see that certainly internationally, but we also see it domestically, and the backlash, whether it's reproductive rights and the like. We're seeing that even now with the start of the new on many fronts. And also a sense of urgency that with the federal election this past fall, that the fact that we were doing a collective review of where we are was really important, because obviously it was going to help position us about where we would wanted the new government, the new federal government to go. So to inform our own plans for advocacy with the new minority, certainly in the context of this new minority government. So that is a brief sort of overview of some of the background. What I wanted to do next was to sort of lay out what the process is for going on right now to mark the 25th anniversary. There's a formal process, which I'll talk about, and there's also a process that's going on among women's organizations around the world to create their own action plan and to ensure that progress is made and to hold back any backsliding. But I should stop there. Were there any questions? Certainly, I know I was racing through a bit of a fast history on the Beijing process. Did anyone have any particular questions they wanted to ask about sort of that background context before we get into the Beijing review process this year?
I don't have any questions yet, but if anyone would like to ask a question out loud, you can raise your hand or put it in the question box and I'll read it out loud for you. So Nothing yet. Maybe we'll
Okay,
let folks think about that, and we can do both at
sure.
the end of the next section.
Okay, so here, as I said, I've got a sort of this bit broken into two bits around the formal review process and then feminist organizing. The formal review process, of course, as you know, is well underway to mark the anniversary, the Beijing anniversary. Last summer, all member states, signatories to the Beijing Declaration, were asked to submit their national reports. And you'll see here, Canada submitted Canada was tad late, but they submitted in summer 2019. And the link there is to the Canadian review. All of the member states, the governments, were asked to submit their reviews for consideration at a series of 5 regional meetings around the world. So Canada is a part of the region that includes Europe, well, North America, Europe, and Central Asia. And so we submitted, there was a regional review that was hosted last October by UN Women and the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe over in Geneva. The process from there, from the regional review, all of the 5 regional reviews are coming together, and they're feeding into a review, the global Beijing review, which is actually taking place at the Commission of Status of Women in March, so the 64th session. So that's a key point of overlap. So all of the information coming in from member states through the regional review process will be taken up in New York in this coming March. UN Women will then be preparing, based on that assessment at CSW 64, we'll be taking that information to creating a synthesis report that will set out a series of recommendations to accelerate the implementation of the platform. And this particular report will be the subject of discussion by heads of state at the UN General Assembly in September 2020. So the September meeting of the UN General Assembly is the key point where heads of state will come together to assess the platform and set directions for the next 5 years. So this is a bit of a roadmap, but just here you can see some of the key points along the way to marking the anniversary, including actually the Women Deliver Conference last June in Vancouver. You'll see the regional meetings were held basically through the fall, and you'll see the CSW in New York as well. This time around, actually, there is another important series of events that are being organized to mark Beijing. There has been debate for a bit of time about whether they should actually host a 5th World Women's Conference to follow up on the 1995 conference, which was the 4th World Conference of Women. In truth, people have always been on the fence about that because they feel that given the shift in the political climate, that any effort to open up the platform would be subject to forces that would actually water it down. So people have argued that they don't want to take that chance. But the downside of not meeting is that there hasn't been an opportunity from women really around the world to come together. And so the idea was born that they would host, the UN Women would organize a global civil society forum, and with the focus here, it's called Generation Equality, but focusing on young leaders to pass the torch along, to provide a platform for feminist activists, member governments, as well as actually in this case, private sector interests in business, to come together to celebrate women's activism and feminist solidarity, but also to set out a concrete agenda for change to realize gender equality before 2030. Gender equality here is a forum to discuss and debate certainly what's needed to move forward, certainly not only with Beijing, with respect to the Beijing platform, but also with the social development goals, which set out, including number 5, which is on gender equality, which sets out a number of targets for the year 2030. So this forum is being held in two related forums. The first gathering is being held in Mexico in April, and the second is being held in July in France. The key Focus for the Generation Equality Forum is there will be a series of what they're calling action coalitions. So UN Women is hoping to launch these coalitions that will bring together member states as well as civil society organizations and the private sector in order to develop blueprints in particular areas that will include concrete actions, investments, and accountability mechanisms, again, to move the gender equality, the Beijing Declaration action forward in the next decade. Membership in these action coalitions is going to be open, and this is a bit of a moving target. Specifically, details on who will lead these action coalitions and the general membership criteria are going to be published actually, I guess, at the end of this week. That's certainly the last information I had. And people have the opportunity to sign up for these action coalitions. And I'll just scoot to the next slide here. And the coalitions will focus on these 6 different areas. So this whole process, this will be the come together, I guess, at the forums in Mexico and in July. But the idea will be these coalitions will certainly be launched at the April forum, and hopefully many groups will be able to sign up and participate along with this. Canada, for instance, as one government, certainly is being lobbied to be a lead on one of these coalitions. I'm not sure which one they will eventually, but they are hoping to have key governments or key states take the lead along with civil society groups and private sector partners and youth to create the global blueprints for action related to these areas. So that's the fourth, and the idea being that these blueprints will again be information or will be fed into the UN meeting in September, the UN General Assembly meeting in September. So that is the formal process. At the same time, women's organizations around the world are also organizing their participation, and you'll see this is coming. So this group, women's groups and coalitions, are coming together to, as I said, in many ways to influence and participate and engage with the Beijing review process. Certainly, groups around the world are producing their own parallel reports, such as we've done in Canada. Some of these groups had a civil society came together at the regional meetings in October. In Canada, many groups from Canada participated in the Civil Society Forum in Geneva. And of course, critically, lots of CSOs will be going to CSW in New York, and they will be providing their input to the global Beijing review process there, as well as to the agreed conclusion statements from the CSW for the CSW and the work plan in the next year. As well, there will be civil society representation at the Gender Equality Forum. Certainly member states are in the process of setting out, or the UN Women is in the process of setting out the selection process. I'm not sure at this point, it's unclear how civil women's groups will be chosen to attend these meetings in Mexico or July. The funding's unclear. There's no sense from the Canadian government whether they'll be sponsoring civil society organizations to attend. That's all in the works right now, but there will be representation from women's movements at these events for sure. The UN, the group that coordinates the NGOs, the NGO CSW in New York, which is supported by UN Women, decided that it would be really important going into this important year that it to contribute not only the strategies and recommendations from the national parallel reports, such as unfinished business, but that it would be really desirable to create a single feminist and women's movement action plan to encourage a much bolder and more, a much bolder course of action to realize the gender equality goals in the declaration. So NGO SCW has brought together many leading feminist activists and experts, and they are coordinating the development of a feminist and women's movement action plan. And the goal or the idea here was to help break down some of the silos and to create a framework that would that would be important to create or a framework and an action plan that would really give substance to or make meaningful recommendations for change. So this process is ongoing. Hang on. So this process started last August, and they, at that time, NGO CSW created 6 thematic working groups to start work on this feminist action plan. Some of those groups came together at the regional planning sessions in the fall, at the 5 different regional sessions at this in the civil society forum. And at this very time, what's happening is that these 6 groups are hosting a series of virtual meetings in January through March in the lead up to the preparation of the final global plan, which is going to be finalized at the CSW in March. Now, as I said, these 6 thematic working groups actually are open to women's organizations and others who want to participate. I've got the link included in this particular slide. And for those who would like to attend the virtual group meetings that are presenting, I guess they're the work to date and the types of recommendations being proposed, those too, you can register for those. You'll see the link there. So the idea is that the feminist organizations will be taking the demands of the action plan to the Generation Equality Forum in April and July, and then again to the UN General Assembly in September. And the hope as well is that with this feminist action plan, that these groups, the feminist and women's groups, will then participate in the action coalitions, and again, to ensure that those blueprints in the formal process actually reflect a bold vision and and are effective to push forward meaningful change. And just to be confusing, here are the 6 thematic working groups that are currently working. That's generally parallel the 6 action coalitions that are being proposed under at the forum. And there's a link there for people who are interested and would like more information. I'm going to stop there to see if there are any questions. I fully recognize this is hopelessly complicated. It certainly was as I was trying to pull all of this information together. There are lots, obviously. New York's going to be a really key moment to bring groups together, hopefully not only to participate in the formal process, but also in influence the Canadian government, but also to engage in the global feminist process that it's attempting to craft a global feminist agenda for moving issues forward. Keitha, did you any questions? I'm happy, or the next bit's really segueing to Canada. So
yes, I have Anya has her hand up, so let me just unmute you. All right, Anya, I think you need to unmute yourself and then you're...
Yeah, I just unmuted myself. Thank you. I just have a quick question. I will be going to New York, and I wasn't familiar with all of that, so thank you very much with all the background information. This was extremely helpful. This is great. Now, I have a question in terms of overall the delegation, the work, all of that. It's always talked about feminist organizations, feminist movements, but when I look who really implements all this globally, the majority, and we all know that the majority of the leaders are male. So I wonder about how much men are going to be involved in that as well, because it's all about the women, the women, the women screaming out, but I don't hear anything about what has been done on the men's side and reaching those governments, because they are again making decisions for the women, but we need men allies. That's just my question. It's maybe a little bit off topic. Let me know, no problem. But I thought I'd put that question in.
So you're talking about the heads of state being largely male, which is totally true. I don't want to put words in your mouth here. Yeah, certainly, you know, I think that the challenge at any global event of this nature is that there are governments of different political stripes, regardless of whether they have a male or female head of state, and some are much more conservatively oriented. It's also the case that we have experience with authoritarian governments, for instance, using spaces like around women's rights to, negatively. The politics of that's very challenging. So it's incumbent upon governments like Canada, which certainly are expressly feminist in orientation, to assist in hopefully work with like-minded peers to shape the process and the politics. I know a lot of energy goes into the final text of the conclusions from the CSW meeting each year in New York. There will be a lot of as well behind the scenes about what the UN Women's Report to the General Assembly will be. As respects to the groups, women's groups, for instance, or feminist groups that will participate on the CSO processes, such as in the developing the Feminist Action Plan, there will be criteria for engagement in that process. I mean, there have been certainly. The feminist movement is not homogenous, as we all know. Certainly there are sets of principles that people aspire to. Bringing intersectional focus to the work is critically important. Being accepting of human, feminist, and women's rights is critically important. So there are, there's attention is being paid to representation of women's organizations, feminist organizations at these global events and in these processes to ensure that hopefully they're not hijacked by folks who have interests other than women's rights.
Thanks, Catherine. I have a question, and actually the answer to the question in the question box. So there was a question around clarifying when the meeting in Mexico is, and then the answer to that from someone else says that the dates for the Generation Equality meeting in Mexico is May 7th and 8th.
May 7th and 8th. Oh, it's not in April? They pushed it. Okay, sorry, that's great if somebody's got the updated. It's been a bit of a moving target, so initially, so that's great. Sorry for that. Yes, the dates have just been chosen. I think they're up on the website. Some of the links are at the NGOS and Generation Equality website have all the up-to-date information.
Thanks. That's all the questions I have for now.
Okay, perfect. Well, here in Canada, I just want to finish, I know I'm conscious of the time, to speak a bit about the report that we did, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives published this past October in time for the regional review in Geneva. There's the cover. This is actually the longest report we've ever done, which it was a great process coming together of many different groups to produce this. So our task, the Beijing Plus 25 network came together, as I said, to look at progress in Canada on gender equality over the last 5 years. In the original platform, you'll see if you've look at it or read it, there are 12 priority areas of concern were identified. These are, we had certainly guidance on what to include. These were areas we were to address in our report, but certainly, 25 years later, there are many different other areas that are really important. And so our group, through a process of discussion and so forth, actually came up and have produced 22 chapters in total, 22 different areas that we looked at. In the network, different lead authors or lead organizations were identified or volunteered or were voluntold, and then other groups could then form the working group. So each chapter had its own working group who came together with, with a particular word count, which everybody went over, and we're tasked this time around not only to look at what were the key, and this was largely a federal focus, what were the key milestones milestones over the last number of years in terms of progress and challenges, but also to produce a set of recommendations for moving forward. That would be important not only to feed into the global process, but really, you know, it was a basis or a starting point for domestic advocacy, because obviously this has to hit the ground in Canada and support women's advocacy in groups across the country. So that certainly, we were very conscious of the facts. So to do an assessment and to look at where we might go, that was really important. So different drafts were struck by the working group. They were vetted by the folks on that team. The different drafts then came to me, and we had a steering group of many groups, like of 7 or 8, who were involved in reviewing all of the material. You know, I took a bit of a size to it. I sort of whipped it into shape into one document, and we produced the final draft, I guess, in time for the regional review. It really was important from the onset, and certainly this is something that we did, was to apply a feminist intersectional lens. And we were very conscious, you know, that this can be challenging. I had the tremendous good fortune to work with Dawn, which is the Disabled Women's Network of Canada, who themselves were actually doing their own and have done, and I should have included the link here. They've done a fantastic Beijing review parallel report from the perspective of women and girls with disabilities. So we brought all of that information, certainly the women from racialized communities, and certainly their work. So we made a very conscious, studied effort to apply a feminist intersectional lens to the entirety of the entire document that we produced, as well as highlighting the challenges in certain chapters, certainly around Indigenous women in Canada, racialized women, immigrant and newcomer women, and women with disabilities in particular. So as well, and women from the LGBT, women and gender diverse people from the LGBT plus Q2S community. So that certainly was our intent, and worked that through. And we were very conscious, certainly, that the challenge in a document like this, where we're looking at women's progress as pertains to the Beijing document, is obviously that looking at national averages, something like the wage gap and so forth, really does mask more than it presents important information, but it also masks an enormous amount, and that the different experiences of different groups of women are critical to understanding the impact of economic inequality in Canada. So we were very conscious of that, and looked to provide as disaggregated information as we could in each of the areas and chapters. I wanted to give you this is just a quick overview of the table of contents. You'll see there's a range of different areas. We've looked, certainly childcare is there. There's a chapter on criminalized and imprisoned women, Canada's foreign policy, a chapter on the environment, changes to decision-making and institutional mechanisms for advancing women, women gender equality in Canada, and a final chapter on data and statistics. So it covers a range of areas that I hope you can use. And, you know, I can certainly get into some of the substance of each of the chapters, but certainly the key takeaway, you know, and it was an interesting discussion because obviously the last 5 years was a marked departure from the previous 10 years. We saw, for instance, with the new Liberal government in 2015, the appointment of the first gender balanced cabinet, and certainly more diverse judiciary. We saw status of women was transformed into a full department, and they have certainly expanded the use of GBA plus across government. The Canada's, and arguably some of the most notable and significant investments were international ones. That Canada has its first feminist international assistance policy. It actually took steps and launched its strategy to prevent gender-based violence. And the government passed proactive pay equity legislation and gender budgeting legislation again, which were have been key asks from the women's movement for a long time. But, you know, that said, these really important wins notwithstanding, Canada is certainly not nearly close enough to meeting our commitments as included in the Beijing platform, or the goals set out under the Sustainable Development the Sustainable Development Agenda by 2030. I wanted to conclude, and I'm happy to, if people have questions about the content of the report, we can check in at the end. I just wanted to summarize some of the ways that people can engage with the current process. Hopefully, not only as part of the members of the Women's Foundation delegation, but generally within the global process and how we can engage domestically. So certainly women's groups here in Canada or those interested can participate in the development of the Feminist and Women's Movement Action Plan. Obviously, you will be connecting at CSW 64 and providing input into those draft conclusions and the work plan. So the New York meeting is a critical point of intervention and engagement for women's organizations and the like. And women's groups obviously can participate, can register to participate in planning for generation equality and the proposed action coalitions. And the hope is that many groups will register to help shape the direction of this work and the content of the blueprints that are going to go forward. On the domestic front, the Beijing Plus 25 network is certainly happy to hear from this remains open and active. I wanted to stress the parallel report that we produced, Unfinished Business, certainly was produced as a resource for the gender justice advocacy in Canada, certainly in local communities and the like. But we really knew then in producing those recommendations for change that really it was a work in progress, and that we would hope it would benefit hugely from additional work and workshopping about the particular recommendations and how to create tools for meaningful change in the community. So we're hoping to continue to talk about our own goals for Canada or the gender justice in the coming year, to use Unfinished Business as a platform for further outreach and engagement, and certainly deepening the intersectional perspective that we're bringing to bear on our work and centering the experience of the most marginalized. So lots ahead. It's going to be a very busy year. And many of you will be involved, and then hopefully this has been a useful orientation to what's coming up. So Keitha, I'll leave it there for take some questions if there are any.
All right, thank you very much, Catherine. This is a really helpful overview.
Yeah.
And you're right that it is a wildly complicated process with lots of moving parts. I just wanted to say that from the Dawn summary report that you mentioned, we put up the link to the executive summary in the chat box, so if anyone's looking for it. And the full report is not available yet, so keep checking back on the Dawn website for that. We have a question from Tara House. Tara, I'm just going to unmute you if you would like to ask a question.
Am I unmuted on your end?
You are.
Okay, perfect. Hi, thank you so much for doing this, Catherine. I really appreciate it. And to the Canadian Women's Foundation for supporting it. It's been wonderful. I haven't read the Unfinished Business report, so I recognize my answer is probably in that report, but you did mention that there were some key disparities that still exist between the SDG goals and Beijing 25. And so I'm just wondering if you could highlight a couple. What are the biggest gaps that still exist? And also, what have the biggest gains been that we've seen? Or is the gains what you talked about earlier there?
Well, those are certainly the summary of the major moments, I guess, in the last government that were, milestones like proactive pay equity legislation, the feminist foreign policy, the announcement of large $700 million for women's reproductive health globally. I think those are really important wins for the women's movement in Canada. But at the same time, obviously, we're quite a distance away from what anyone would describe as gender, gender equality. The key areas, certainly in disparities that emerge when you look at some of this, look at the indexes and reports on this sort of thing, is there huge economic barriers that are still persistent. The wage gap certainly is one area that has seen little change in the last little while. women's representation and decision making and so forth. Even, you know, certainly in public fora, Canada, we saw a bit of a bump this last election, up to 29%, but still woefully short of where it should be. Certainly that's there's less representation if you look at women in management in private sector and you know, in companies and the like, as opposed to parliaments. So we've made change there has been very slow. You know, at the end of the day, levels of violence are just it's, you know, hugely problematic and devastating for the lives of so many women. So these are some of the areas that we highlight and note, for instance, in an area like violence, that the women who are subject to the greatest levels of violence, Indigenous women, women with disabilities, and others from the LGBT community, they're, you know, it's a profound abuse of human rights. So these are the types of challenges that we identify. Access to reproductive health rights in Canada is not equitable across the country. Each chapter speaks to the challenges that continue to exist that demand action.
Thanks for that question, Dara. Just a reminder for folks, if you're looking for the unfinished business report or the Beijing Platform for Action, they're in the handouts, as is the PDF of these slides if you're looking for the links. And if you want to ask a question, you can either raise your hand or put it in the question box. So I have another one here from Anya. Anya, I've just unmuted you if you want to.
Perfect, just got it, thank you. I have a quick question. When you outlined all the stakeholders or all the groups that are participating in your unfinished business report, I was wondering, were the women and male-dominated professions are fitting in? We're often grouped to certain areas, but we have a lot of unique to being in the workforce with a heavily male-dominated workforce. So, and then my sub comment was women in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math.
I'll throw out, I can move my slide along. I've got a list actually of resources and the groups that were involved. I think, hang on. Oh, did it go? No, there we are. There's the list of the groups that were involved in the network, currently involved. And your question is whether there were women in STEM organizations, national ones. The Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women, as well as the Canadian Association for University Teachers, and were involved. They focus, part of those organizations focus on women in non-traditional, but we didn't have any other national level groups that were involved in STEM subjects specifically, directly involved, but certainly the issues of STEM and participation in non-traditional fields of study certainly were covered in the Women in Education chapter for sure.
Okay, so just looking to see if there are any other questions. Give folks a second to think of them.
Yep. There we go. There's some of the links as well in the PDF if people are interested.
All right, doesn't look like anything burning coming in. Oh, wait, one more. What are the next steps for the report? Are you presenting it to the government?
We did send it to the government, and we've been have not had the occasion. We've been trying to get a meeting with Minister Monsef and her new political staff. Have not heard back yet. That's an ongoing process, I guess. You know, it's collaborating certainly with the government. Obviously, they are organizing and their participation in New York. Certainly we're not 100% sure what the government's, what their list of priorities will be for those negotiations. Certainly we've been reaching out and asking and hope that we will end up. It's been part of a process post-election trying to reach out not only to government but also to the new parties it's been quite slow actually getting off the ground, like appointing people who are the point people for the different parties that will be looking at the gender file, or understanding in the political offices. So we haven't had much luck yet, which is disappointing, but hopefully that will change in the next month.
All right, so no other hands raised or questions in the question box. So I wanted to say again, a big thank you to you, Katherine, for doing this presentation. We really appreciate it, and the opportunity to get into the weeds a little bit on how this is working, especially for folks, well, also for folks going down to New York who will be observing and trying to influence this process a bit, and for those that aren't going to New York and want to know what on earth is going on down there. So
yeah, stay tuned.
yeah, so lots apparently. Thank you all for joining. If you have any questions for Katherine, she has kindly put up her email address in the slides. If you want access to this recording, I will be sending it out to everyone who attended. And please don't forget to download the handouts. So thank you again, Katherine, and look forward to talking to you again soon.
Great, thanks so much. It was a pleasure.
Thanks all.